The fog over Paris did not lift that morning, not even as the bells of Saint-Sulpice tolled for the first Mass. The Seine moved sluggishly under the bridges, carrying fragments of wood, paper, a child's toy, as though the river itself was swallowing the city's forgotten life. Near the Quai des Orfèvres, where the stones were slick with moisture and the air smelled of damp rope, a man stood with his hat pulled low and his coat collar turned up. Inspector Maigret drew slowly on his pipe, the embers glowing faintly in the grey light, his eyes narrowed not against the chill, but against a thought that would not leave him. Somewhere in this dense and unbroken fog there was a story, a man's silence, a woman's fear, a truth hidden beneath layers of Parisian shadows. And Maigret, steady as the tide itself, would follow it until it yielded. If you are drawn to mysteries that move like this river, unhurried, inevitable, rich with eddies and hidden depths, then linger here with us. Subscribe, share, and keep the lamp of curiosity lit. For the stories of Maigret, like the Seine, carry more than they reveal at first glance. The river had a way of revealing its secrets at dawn, when the city was still shrouded in a damp greyness that softened even the sound of carriage wheels on cobblestones. It was at that hour, when the lamps on the embankment had not yet been extinguished, that two fishermen noticed a shape caught against the pilings near the Pont Marie. At first, it seemed no more than driftwood, a swollen log carried downstream from some forgotten wharf. But the way it turned in the current, the stiff angle of its arm, raised as though in silent appeal, told them otherwise. One of the men shouted for the gendarmes, his voice thin against the stillness, and soon the footsteps of policemen echoed on the slippery steps of the quay. Maigret arrived without haste, his heavy frame moving with the calm certainty of one long accustomed to the spectacle of death. He wore his overcoat buttoned tight against the river chill, his hat low over his brow, and the inevitable pipe clenched between his teeth. From afar, in the swirling fog, he looked like a silhouette carved out of the very stones of the Quai des Orfèvres. As he descended the embankment, the smell of wet hemp ropes, tar, and stagnant water rose to meet him. He paused, hands in pockets, gazing down at the men who struggled with poles and hooks to bring the body closer. The scene was quiet, almost ritualistic, the only sound the lapping of the current and the scrape of wood against stone. The drowned man came to rest at the foot of the steps, face turned upward, pale as the belly of a fish. His hair clung to his forehead in dark strands, and his clothes, once fine, were stiff with water and mud. A watch chain gleamed faintly across his waistcoat, though the watch itself was missing. Maigret squatted beside the body, the brim of his hat casting a shadow across his eyes, and studied the man's features with the patient attention of someone reading an old, damaged manuscript. There was no violence upon him save for a bruise at the temple, which might have come from a fall or from something less accidental. The inspector did not speak. He rarely did at such moments. Words were superfluous. It was the silence that yielded impressions, the silence in which he seemed to absorb not only the appearance of the dead, but the weight of the life that had preceded it. The fishermen stood nearby, caps in hand, shifting uneasily on their feet. One of them muttered about bad luck, about the river claiming what it pleased. A gendarme scribbled notes on a damp pad, pausing now and then to glance at Maigret, waiting for direction. But the inspector gave none. He simply drew on his pipe, the smoke curling slowly into the morning mist, and let the river speak in its own slow language. Behind him, a cart rumbled across the bridge, the horses' hooves muffled by the fog, and the city began to stir awake. At last, Maigret rose. "Take him to the morgue," he said quietly, his voice like gravel. The order required no further explanation. The men obeyed, lifting the body with awkward respect, carrying it toward the waiting wagon. Maigret watched until they disappeared into the fog, then turned and climbed the embankment steps, his shoulders broad against the damp air. He did not hurry. He rarely did. He knew that the dead man, wherever he had come from, would wait for him still. At the top of the quay, a small crowd had gathered. Women with baskets paused on their way to market, their shawls drawn tight, eyes wide with morbid curiosity. A pair of clerks whispered together, one crossing himself furtively. The sight of Maigret emerging from the mist silenced them for a moment, as though the inspector himself were the river's emissary. He brushed past them without a glance, moving toward the waiting car that would take him back to the Quai des Orfèvres. Yet, as he walked, a phrase formed in his mind, slow and insistent. This man had not drowned by chance. Back in his office, the kerosene lamp still burned, though daylight now filtered weakly through the tall windows. The room smelled faintly of tobacco and damp wool, the familiar sense of long hours and late nights. Maigret removed his coat, hung it carefully on the stand, and sat heavily at his desk. He struck a match, relit his pipe, and let the first plume of smoke rise before him as though it were a curtain through which the case might reveal itself. He thought of the bruise, the missing watch, the fine though waterlogged clothes, not a vagrant, not one of the faceless poor who too often found their way into the Seine. No, this man had been accustomed to better things. And yet he had ended among the river's detritus, with only silence for company. The file clerk knocked timidly and entered with the first report. Name unknown. No papers found on the body. Age estimated between 40 and 50. Condition drowned. Cause uncertain. The words lay flat on the page, inadequate, like labels affixed to a trunk whose contents remained a mystery. Maigret read them slowly, then set the paper aside. His thoughts wandered to the fishermen, to the expressions of the gendarmes, to the whispering clerks on the quay. Already the story was spreading in fragments and distortions as the Seine carried its rumour through the veins of the city. He leaned back, pipe between his teeth, and allowed his gaze to drift across the office walls. How many times had he begun this same way? A body, a question, a silence that needed filling. Yet each case was different. Each demanded that he strip away not only lies, but layers of ordinary life, the banal routines that men wrapped around themselves like armor. This drowned man, whoever he was, had lived somewhere, eaten in some cafe, exchanged words with some woman, written letters now yellowing in a drawer. To uncover him was to unearth not only crime, but the fragile fabric of existence. The door opened again and Lucas stepped in, his notebook at the ready, his eyes alert. Maigret gestured for him to sit, then spoke slowly, each word weighed. Find out what you can about men reported missing these past weeks. Check the river police, the arrondissements along the banks, boarding houses near the stations, quietly. Lucas nodded, scribbling rapidly, then rose and departed with brisk efficiency. Maigret returned to his silence. He preferred silence to orders. The men knew what to do, and he trusted them. Hours passed. Outside, the fog lifted slightly, revealing the outlines of barges moored along the quays, the grey facades of houses staring blankly across the river. Maigret rose and stood at the window, pipe in hand, watching the sluggish water. How many bodies had the Seine claimed over the centuries? How many secrets lay rotting in its depths? The thought did not disturb him. It was part of the city, as inevitable as rain on zinc rooftops or the hiss of gas lamps at night. Yet today, as he gazed at the current, he felt a faint unease, as though the river had delivered not merely a corpse, but a message. That evening, when he returned to his apartment on Boulevard Richard Lenoir, Madame Maigret greeted him with her usual calm smile. The table was set, the aroma of soup drifting gently through the air. He kissed her cheek, hung his coat, and sat down without a word. She did not ask. She never did at first. Over the clink of spoons, she watched him with quiet patience, and only when the plates were cleared did she remark softly, "The river again?" He looked at her in surprise, then nodded. She knew him too well. She poured tea, her hands steady, her eyes filled with an understanding that required no explanation. In that domestic warmth, the chill of the Seine receded, though it did not vanish. Later, as he sat in his armchair, pipe smoke curling toward the ceiling, Maigret allowed the day's images to settle. Man's pale face, the bruise at his temple, the missing watch, the silence of the fog. Each detail hovered in his mind like pieces of a puzzle not yet cut to fit. He closed his eyes, listening to the distant hum of the city, and felt the weight of the case press upon him like the damp stones of the quay. Somewhere out there, in the narrow streets, in the smoky cafes, in the ledgers of some forgotten clerk, lay the answers. The river had given up its secret, but only in part. The rest awaited him, and he would not rest until he had followed the current to its end. When he opened his eyes, the lamp burned low, and outside the window the night was thick with mist. The Seine flowed unseen beyond the rooftops, carrying its endless burden toward the sea. Maigret drew once more on his pipe, the ember glowing red, and allowed himself a final thought before sleep claimed him. Tomorrow the city would begin to speak, and he would listen. The following morning, Paris was still soaked in dampness, though the fog had lifted enough to reveal the roofs dripping with yesterday's mist, and the blackened chimneys exhaling slow curls of smoke. Maigret left the Quai des Orfèvres with the deliberate step of a man whose instincts were already drawing him toward a particular corner of the city. The drowned man's bruised temple, the missing watch, the faint suggestion of a life lived in better circumstances than his end had planted in the inspector a conviction that he would not find answers in offices or ledgers alone. Lives of such men were threaded through cafes, those half-lit rooms where secrets were whispered more easily than in police stations, and so his steps took him toward the Rue de la Roquette, a street where cafes leaned against each other like conspirators, their windows fogged, their interiors heavy with tobacco and damp wool. The cafe he chose seemed no different from a dozen others at first glance. A chipped sign creaked above the door. A pair of wooden tables stood empty on the pavement, their surfaces slick from last night's rain. Inside, the air was dense with the mingling scents of stale beer, frying fat, and Gauloise's smoke. A yellowed mirror behind the bar caught fragments of faces, distorted by scratches and age. Men hunched over glasses of cheap red wine, their voices low, their eyes shifting toward the door as Maigret entered. His broad frame filled the entrance, his hat casting a shadow across his heavy features, and for a moment the conversations faltered, as though each patron feared the inspector had come specifically for him. He removed his hat, tapped the rain from its brim, and placed it carefully on the counter. Without a word, he ordered a glass of white wine, his voice low and unhurried, his gaze drifting across the room with the quiet patience of a fisherman watching the river's surface for the faintest ripple. The barman, a narrow man with hollow cheeks, poured the wine with exaggerated care, his hands betraying a faint tremor. He knew who stood before him, of course. All of Paris's cafes knew Maigret, or at least thought they did. The inspector sipped slowly, his pipe resting unlit in his pocket, and let the silence draw itself out. It was never his habit to pounce with questions. Rather, He allowed the room to breathe, to betray itself. The men at the tables resumed their murmurs, though more guarded now, voices dropping further, shoulders stooping as if to conceal words in the folds of their coats. A woman in a faded dress carried a tray between tables, her eyes quick but avoiding his. It was in such places, Maigret knew, that the truth often lingered, not in what was said, but in what was withheld. At the far table near the window sat a man who seemed curiously still. He was of middle age, his dark suit shiny with wear at the elbows, his fingers yellowed from tobacco. He stared into his glass as if the dull red liquid might hold an answer he dared not speak. Maigret observed him without appearing to do so, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his gaze slid away when their eyes met briefly in the mirror. The inspector took another slow sip, then set his glass down with a quiet firmness that carried further than any question. The barman cleared his throat. "Bad morning for business, monsieur. The weather keeps decent folk at home." His tone was falsely casual, the kind of remark intended to deflect attention. Maigret responded with a grunt, neither agreement nor contradiction, and continued to study the room. He noticed damp coats hanging by the door, each carrying the smell of rain and smoke, each a possible cloak for unspoken histories. A card game flickered in the corner, the snap of shuffled cards like small gunshots against the hush. Someone laughed too loudly, and the sound died almost at once, embarrassed. When at last he spoke, Maigret's voice was quiet, almost conversational. "A man was found in the river yesterday, near the Pont Marie." His eyes did not leave his glass, yet he felt the ripple travel through the room like a sudden draught. The card players stilled, the woman carrying her tray hesitated, the man in the dark suit drew a sharp breath he could not conceal. The inspector let the silence deepen, his words hanging like smoke in the air. Then he lifted his gaze, heavy and deliberate, to meet the barman's. "You hear many things here. Perhaps you've heard of him." The barman shook his head too quickly, wiping at the counter with a rag already wet. "The river swallows plenty, monsieur, too many to remember." His voice cracked, betraying nerves. Maigret leaned slightly forward, not threatening, simply present, immovable. He said nothing more. The silence returned, heavier than before. The inspector understood that words were not always necessary. Presence alone was often enough to draw the truth nearer. At the table by the window, the man with the tobacco-stained fingers fumbled with his glass, spilled a drop on the wood, and cursed under his breath. He rose abruptly, muttering about an appointment, and reached for his coat. As he passed Maigret, the inspector's hand, broad, firm, deceptively casual, rested on the man's sleeve. "A moment," he murmured. The man froze. His eyes darted not toward the door but toward the others in the room, as though seeking escape through their silence. Maigret gestured toward the empty chair beside him. "Sit." The man obeyed. He lowered himself heavily, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of the inspector's presence pressed him down. For a long while Maigret said nothing, content to let the man feel the gravity of the pause. Finally, in a voice almost gentle, he asked, "You knew him?" The man licked his lips, glanced once more around the café, and nodded. A small nod, barely perceptible, but it was enough. His confession came in fragments, broken by hesitations and evasions. He had seen the drowned man days before, sitting in that very café, speaking quietly with someone in a corner booth, a tall fellow, well-dressed, who left before paying for his drink. The drowned man had seemed uneasy, as though waiting for something or someone. That was all he would admit, yet Maigret felt the tremor in his words, sensed the larger truth pressed tight behind his ribs. He did not push. Pressure too soon would send the man running. Instead, the inspector rose, placed a few coins on the counter, and with a brief nod, left the cafe as deliberately as he had entered. Outside, the street smelled of wet stone and horse dung, the cries of market women drifting from the square beyond. Maigret lit his pipe at last, the flame flaring briefly before the smoke rose in slow curls. He walked unhurriedly down the Rue de la Roquette, his thoughts already sifting through the fragments gleaned. The drowned man had been here. He had waited. He had spoken to someone whose identity was yet concealed, a man tall and well-dressed. And now he was dead. The inspector did not feel triumph at this small revelation, only the steady tightening of a net around a truth still submerged. He knew the cafe would buzz with speculation the moment he departed, whispers spreading like ripples from a stone dropped into water. That too was useful. Rumours often betrayed more than direct testimony. He would return, perhaps not tomorrow, perhaps not for a week, but the cafe would not forget his presence. It would ferment beneath the surface, loosening tongues in his absence. As he reached the end of the street, Maigret paused, exhaling smoke into the damp air. The drowned man's story was no longer mute. It had spoken in the tremor of a barman's hand, in the faltering words of a patron, in the silence that thickened when his name was invoked. And though the river had tried to conceal him, Paris itself was beginning to yield. Night would come again, with its fog and its shadows, but Maigret felt the faint stirrings of direction. Somewhere, between the embankment and this smoky cafe, lay the thread he must follow. The river had released its burden, and now the city itself would conspire to reveal the rest. The weight of the river and its secrets did not follow Maigret into every room, though it lingered about him like the scent of his pipe tobacco, impossible to shake off entirely. When he returned that evening to the apartment on Boulevard Richard-Lenoir, the gaslight above the stairwell flickered with a tired flame, and the smell of boiled cabbage drifted from a neighbour's door. He climbed the steps slowly, his heavy frame burdened not only by the day's inquiries, but by the silence of a case that had not yet chosen to speak in full. Yet as he reached his own door and turned the familiar key, the atmosphere shifted, as it always did. The world outside, with its fog and its rumours, its wet stones and anonymous faces, gave way to the measured calm of Madame Maigret. She was in the kitchen when he entered, sleeves rolled to the elbow, her hair tied back loosely, the steam of simmering potatoes blurring the panes of the small window. She turned with a smile, neither surprised nor hurried, and greeted him with the same warmth she reserved for all his returns, whether he came from an evening stroll or from the Seine bearing death. "You're late," she said softly, though without reproach. Her words, like her presence, were simple and unadorned, yet they settled over Maigret with the comfort of a heavy wool blanket on a cold night. He removed his coat, hung it carefully, and washed his hands in the small basin near the door, the water cold and metallic. She set the table, plates warmed, a bottle of light wine already opened. They sat opposite each other, the rhythm of their shared life so ingrained it required no words. Only when the soup was served and the first mouthfuls taken did she glance at him, her eyes holding quiet curiosity. "The river again?" she asked, as she had the night before. He nodded, chewing slowly, unwilling to disturb the domestic calm with the harsh details of a swollen corpse and a bruise at the temple. Yet she did not require those details. She had lived alongside his work too long, had folded its shadows into her own routine with a grace that astonished him still. Her questions were never direct, never the clumsy probes of gossip, but gentle prods that seemed almost accidental, as though her mind had drifted to a thought that happened to be useful. And more often than not it was. "Did he have family?" she asked after a while, breaking bread with calm fingers. The question struck Maigret because it had not yet struck him. He had thought of the man's clothes, his missing watch, his fearful presence in the café before his end, but not of the simple matter of whether someone waited for him at home, or if someone now sat at a window staring into the night for news that would never come. The inspector grunted, set down his spoon, and frowned. "We don't know yet." Madame Maigret sipped her soup, her expression unreadable. "Then perhaps he wasn't alone in the world. Perhaps someone will come to claim him." She said it lightly, almost absently, yet the words sank deep. Maigret realized with a twinge that while he and his men hunted through records and testimonies, through suspicious barmen and silent patrons, a woman somewhere might be waiting in despair, clinging to hope. It gave the dead man a human contour he had not fully drawn yet. The rest of dinner passed in silence, save for the clink of cutlery and the faint sounds of carriages passing below. When they had finished, she cleared the table with her usual efficiency, and he lit his pipe, sinking into the armchair that groaned under his weight. She returned with tea, sat in her own chair, and took up her embroidery, the needle glinting in the lamplight. They sat thus for some time, each absorbed in their own rhythm, yet bound by a quiet intimacy that required no speech. It was during such silences that Maigret often found clarity. He did not need to speak aloud. The presence of his wife, steady and unintrusive, seemed to arrange his thoughts into order. He thought of the café, of the man who had faltered under his gaze, of the tall figure who had left without paying. He considered the bruise at the temple and the missing watch. Details that had seemed disconnected began to align faintly, not in hard lines, but in suggestive patterns. He puffed slowly, watching the smoke curl upward, and let his mind wander in the way Madame Maigret had taught him to allow, patient, unforced, like waiting for dough to rise. At length, she said, without lifting her eyes from her needlework, "You looked tired when you came in. Not your body, your eyes. He must have troubled you, that man from the river." The remark startled him not because it was true, but because she had seen it when he had not yet admitted it to himself. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You see too much." She smiled, continued her stitching. "I see you." The night deepened. Outside, the fog crept back along the boulevard, muffling the sound of hooves and wheels. Inside, the lamp sputtered faintly, and Maigret closed his eyes, pipe resting against his lips, the taste of tobacco and tea lingering. Images flickered across his mind, the drowned man's pale face, the tense café, the man with yellowed fingers, and beside those images the quiet insistence of his wife's questions, family, waiting, the unseen grief of someone not yet named. It gave him a direction he had lacked, a reminder that his cases were not only puzzles, but the unravelling of human lives. When he stirred from his reverie, Madame Maigret was already clearing her embroidery, folding it neatly, preparing for bed. He watched her with a tenderness he rarely expressed aloud. Her presence grounded him, tethered him to the simplest truths when the labyrinth of the city threatened to swallow him whole. Without her, he suspected, he might have drifted like one of those nameless men the Seine delivered at dawn, weighed down by silence. With her, he carried his burden more lightly, though never without gravity. Later, as he lay in bed beside her, the window cracked open to let in the cool, damp air. He listened to the distant bells striking midnight. She breathed evenly, already half asleep, while he stared at the ceiling, mind alive. He thought of the telegram that might come, the lead that might draw him away from Paris, perhaps to a harbour town where the drowned man had left unfinished business. The case was widening, he felt it in his bones. The city was only the beginning. The river was a messenger, carrying secrets from far beyond the bridges of Paris. He turned onto his side, glanced at his wife's profile in the lamplight, and murmured almost to himself, "We'll see where he takes us." She stirred, not fully awake, and whispered, "Be careful." Then she sank again into sleep, leaving him with the echo of her words, simple, unadorned, yet heavy with meaning. Be careful. As though she sensed the current would carry him further than either of them expected. When dawn came, pale and hesitant, Maigret rose quietly so as not to disturb her. He dressed, filled his pipe, and looked once more at the still form of Madame Maigret beneath the quilt. He allowed himself a moment of stillness, a silent acknowledgement of the anchor she provided, before stepping out once more into the chill morning. The Seine awaited him, and with it the next fragment of the drowned man's story. The telegram arrived just after midday, when the inspector had returned to his office at the Quai des Orfèvres, pipe smoke still curling lazily in the air from the morning's reflections. It came folded neatly on pale yellow paper, the words stamped with the clipped precision of the telegraph office. The message was short, brusque, and yet it altered the rhythm of the day with the force of a tide turning. Unidentified mail, resemblance to Paris case. Boarding house in Le Havre, inquires. Suggest immediate. Maigret stared at the line of type without moving for a long moment. The clatter of typewriters in nearby offices, the shuffling of clerks, the ringing of telephones, all faded into a kind of muffled hum. His gaze remained fixed on those words, on the strange conjunction of Paris and Le Havre, of a drowned body and a boarding-house landlady who had thought to send a message. He felt, as he often did at such moments, the slow tightening of the net. The river had released its burden in Paris, but its current stretched far beyond the bridges. The sea, perhaps, had whispered back. He folded the telegram carefully, slipped it into his breast pocket, and rose from his chair with the same deliberate heaviness that marked all his movements. Lucas, passing in the corridor, caught the look in his chief's eyes and paused, notebook in hand. "Le Havre," Maigret said simply. Lucas nodded, asked no further questions, and made a note. Orders would follow, but the inspector preferred silence first, letting the idea settle, letting the weight of the word boarding house expand in his mind. By mid-afternoon he was at the Gare Saint-Lazare, ticket in hand, pipe clamped between his teeth. The station was alive with its usual confusion, porters shouting, luggage trolleys clattering over iron grates, passengers hurrying in coats, too thin for the sea wind awaiting them. The smell of coal smoke and damp newspapers hung in the cavernous hall, mingling with the whistle of engines. Maigret moved through it all without haste, a steady bulk in a sea of restless bodies. He boarded his train, found a seat by the window, and settled in with the composure of a man resigned to long hours of observation. The journey northward carried him through fields still slick with rain, villages huddled against the cold, and the gradual scent of salt borne on the wind as the train approached the coast. At each stop, the faces of provincial travellers climbed aboard, their chatter unguarded, their concerns ordinary. Maigret listened absently, letting fragments of conversation wash over him like the rhythm of wheels on rails. He thought of the drowned man's pale features, of the bruise at the temple, of the café on Rue de la Roquette, where silence had betrayed knowledge. And now Le Havre, a boarding house, a landlady with memory sharp enough to recognize a face. When he stepped onto the platform at Le Havre, evening was settling over the port. The air carried the brine of the channel, sharper and colder than Paris, mixed with the tar and fish that clung to the harbour. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries harsh, insistent, like warnings shouted in a tongue no man could understand. Maigret turned up the collar of his coat and made his way through the station's arched exit, where carriages and carts jostled amid a confusion of sailors and dock workers. He felt immediately the difference from Paris. The port was a city unto itself, both harsher and more transient, where men arrived and disappeared with the tides, leaving little trace behind. The boarding-house stood on a narrow street that sloped down toward the docks, its shutters flaking, its sign half obscured by soot. A single lamp burned above the entrance, casting a pool of yellow on the wet pavement. Maigret pushed open the door and was met by the smell of cabbage, soap, and damp wool. Behind a small counter stood the landlady, a stout woman with hair pulled into a severe bun, her hands red from scrubbing. She looked up, startled by the bulk of the inspector filling her doorway, then composed herself with the dignity of one accustomed to sailors and strangers. "You sent word?" Maigret asked quietly, removing his hat. His presence required no introduction. The cut of his coat, the pipe, the steady weight of his gaze made clear enough who he was. She nodded briskly and reached beneath the counter for a photograph, the kind taken cheaply in provincial studios. She slid it across the worn wood. He stayed here. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Paid regularly, always in cash. Polite, quiet. I saw his picture in the paper this morning, the one they found in your river. I thought, better to be certain. Maigret studied the photograph, though he hardly needed confirmation. The face was the same, the receding hairline, the firm jaw, the eyes that seemed both guarded and resigned. Yet in the photograph he was alive, upright, clothes neat, gaze fixed on the camera as though awaiting judgment. The inspector returned the image, slipped his hands into his coat pockets and asked, "Did he receive visitors?" The landlady hesitated, wiping her hands on her apron. "A few, always the same man, tall, well-dressed. I remember because he wore gloves even indoors, the kind of gloves you don't see on dock workers." Her voice lowered, instinctively cautious. They spoke in low tones. Sometimes they argued. Once I heard the word debts, that's all. Maigret's pipe remained unlit in his hand, but he chewed on its stem as he listened. The tall man again, the same shadow glimpsed in the Paris café, the same figure who had vanished without paying for his drink. The net was tightening. "Do you know his name?" The landlady shook her head. "He signed the register, but it was not his name. I could tell. It said Dupont, but I've seen too many Duponts come through my door." She reached for the worn ledger and opened it for him. The neat scrawl of Dupont stared up from the page, meaningless, yet pregnant with deceit. Maigret closed the book gently, as though it were an artifact rather than a mere ledger. "Thank you," he said simply. She nodded, grateful for the courtesy, though clearly unnerved by the memory of her guest. He left the boarding-house and stepped once more into the salt-stained night. The harbour lights flickered across black water, casting long streaks toward the sea. Ships loomed like shadows, their masts swaying against the stars. The cries of gulls mingled with the creak of ropes and the distant clang of iron. Maigret drew deep on his pipe at last, the tobacco burning steady, and stood for a long while, gazing out at the endless horizon. The drowned man had lived here, however briefly. He had met the tall, gloved man here, spoken of debts, perhaps of betrayal. From the boarding-house to the Paris café, from Le Havre to the Pont Marie, the line stretched taut, invisible yet undeniable. The inspector felt it vibrate under his hand like the string of a violin. He did not yet know its music, but he would. The sea wind tugged at his coat, and Maigret turned back toward his inn, his heavy step unhurried. He would send word to Lucas and Janvier, set them upon the trail of Dupont, of debts, of gloved hands and whispered arguments. For now he allowed the rhythm of the port to seep into him. The roll of tides, the clang of chains, the murmur of men who lived by departure. The drowned man had been one of them once, half belonging, half estranged. And the sea, like the river, gave up its dead only reluctantly. As he climbed the narrow stair to his room, Maigret felt the current carrying him deeper into the drowned man's life. Tomorrow, the search would widen. Tonight, he would sleep with the salt of Le Havre still in his nostrils, the cry of gulls echoing in his ears, and the certainty that the story was far from finished. When the train back to Paris rattled through the night, carrying with it not only Maigret's heavy frame, but the echoes of Le Havre's harbour, the smell of salt, and the half-truths of a boarding-house landlady. By the time dawn broke pale and weary over the capital, he was already stepping once more into the courtyard of the Quai des Orfèvres, his pipe smoke rising to mingle with the damp morning air. He was tired, but in the measured way of a man accustomed to long pursuits, his fatigue not a burden, but a steady companion. The sea had yielded fragments, and he was prepared now to sift them against the ledgers and corridors of Paris. The drowned man had debts. That word, overheard in whispers, gnawed at Maigret. Debts meant records, and records meant clerks, those anonymous sentinels who guarded the city's labyrinth of paper. It was in those ink-stained archives, among ledgers stacked higher than a man's shoulders, that the truth would be hidden, not shouted, never shouted, but quietly waiting in a misfiled entry, a signature, a transaction too hastily covered. Maigret knew the type, clerks who sat bent over their desks from dawn to dusk, pale men whose world was ink and pen, whose trembling fingers betrayed the weight of secrets they had not been asked to carry. By mid-morning he was striding down a narrow corridor of the Palais de Justice, his shoes echoing against worn tiles, the walls lined with doors bearing brass plaques. He entered one such office without ceremony, filling the room with his presence, the fog of his coat, and the faint scent of tobacco. The clerk at the desk looked up sharply, blinking behind round spectacles. His fingers, blackened at the tips with dried ink, froze above the page he had been writing. He was a thin man, no older than 30, with hollow cheeks and the wary eyes of someone who had long since resigned himself to being overlooked. "Your name?" Maigret asked, his tone steady, not unkind, but heavy enough to pin the man in place. The clerk swallowed, adjusted his spectacles, and gave it. It was an ordinary name, forgettable. Maigret barely listened. He was watching the fingers, stained with ink, trembling slightly now as they gripped the pen. The inspector settled into the chair opposite, the wood creaking under his weight, and drew his pipe from his pocket, though he did not light it. "There was a man," Maigret began, "registered in Le Havre under the name Dupont. You've seen the reports." The clerk nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing. "He had debts, and debts passed through hands such as yours." Maigret leaned forward slightly, the pipe stem turning between his fingers. "So tell me, where do they lead?" The clerk glanced toward the shelves as though the rows of ledgers might shield him, then back at the inspector. His lips parted, closed, parted again. Finally he stammered, "Monsieur, there are so many records. I wouldn't know where to begin." Maigret said nothing. He let the silence fill the room, heavy and inexorable, the kind of silence that made men squirm. The only sound was the faint scratch of a pen from a neighbouring desk through the thin partition. The clerk shifted, wiped his ink-stained fingers on a rag and whispered, "But I do remember him. Not Dupont, but his real name. He came here once, weeks ago, nervous. Paid part of what he owed. He signed with a trembling hand. The inspector's eyes narrowed slightly. And the creditor? The clerk's gaze dropped to his desk. He fiddled with the pen, leaving smudges on the paper. His voice was lower now, almost conspiratorial. A company, respectable on the surface. But behind it, a man. Tall, well-dressed, always gloved. He came himself once to check the account. Not many creditors bother to do that. There it was again. The tall man, the gloves, the silent presence threading through every corner of the drowned man's life. Maigret felt the shape of the story pressing closer, though still cloaked in mist. He watched the clerk, who now sat rigid, as though afraid he had already said too much. "You'll show me the record," Maigret said, not as a request but as a fact already decided. The clerk hesitated, glanced again toward the shelves, then rose with visible reluctance. He moved among the ledgers, his fingers trembling as they traced the spines, leaving faint streaks of ink. At last he pulled one free, thick and bound in cracked leather, and set it before the inspector. The smell of dust rose as it opened, pages filled with neat columns of numbers and names. He turned to a page marked by the faint crease of recent use. There it was, the drowned man's true name, written in his own hand, shaky but legible. And beside it, the notation of debt, the sum heavy enough to cripple a modest man, owed to a company with an innocuous name that carried no meaning on the surface. But in the margin, a signature in bolder hand, elegant and precise, the creditor himself. The tall man. Maigret stared at the signature for a long while, drawing on his pipe, though it was still unlit. The letters were clear, but the name was unfamiliar. That did not matter. Names could be traced, signatures compared, companies investigated. What mattered was the confirmation that the shadow in the café and the visitor in Le Havre were the same. The drowned man's death had not been a matter of despair or chance. It was tethered to this signature, to debts enforced not by law, but by something darker. The clerk shifted nervously, his ink-stained fingers clasped tightly in his lap. "I should not have shown you this," he murmured, as though fearing punishment from unseen hands. Maigret rose slowly, the chair groaning as he did. "You did what was necessary," he said simply. His tone carried no comfort, yet it was enough to ease the man's fear slightly. The inspector slipped the details into his vast, patient memory and left the office without another word. Outside, the corridors hummed with footsteps and murmurs, the daily machinery of justice grinding on. Yet for Maigret, the air seemed charged, thick with the presence of the tall man's shadow. He walked unhurriedly toward the exit, pipe now lit, smoke curling upward as though marking his path. The Seine awaited him outside, its sluggish waters reflecting the grey sky, indifferent to the truths uncovered in dusty ledgers. He paused on the steps of the Palais de Justice, the city sprawling before him. Carriages rattled across bridges, children shouted in the squares, a newspaper boy cried the day's headlines. Paris went on oblivious, and yet, within its folds, men like the drowned one lived their small tragedies, while men like the tall creditor moved silently, gloves concealing hands that grasped too tightly. That evening, back in his office, Maigret called for Lucas and Janvier. They gathered, each with notebooks ready, their loyalty worn as naturally as their coats. He spoke slowly, outlining the connections. The boarding house in Le Havre, the café en Rue de la Roquette, the debts, the clerk's testimony, the signature of the tall man. They listened intently, their faces shadowed by the lamplight, nodding as the strands wove into a pattern. "Find him," Maigret said at last. "The creditor. Quietly, he will not be far." Lucas and Janvier departed with brisk steps, eager, their faith in Maigret's instinct unshaken. Alone again, the inspector sank heavily into his chair, pipe in hand, eyes fixed on the darkening window. The city outside was a tangle of alleys and whispers, but the thread was in his grasp now. The ink-stained fingers of a nervous clerk had pointed the way. The drowned man had been a debtor, yes, but also a man caught in currents stronger than himself. And the river, impartial as always, had delivered him to Maigret's feet. It was the inspector's task now to follow the current back to its source, to the tall man whose gloves left no stains of ink, only the marks of power hidden in silence. The Seine flowed on beneath the bridges, carrying with it the faint reflection of lamps, the cries of bargemen, the secrets of men. Maigret sat motionless, smoke rising slowly about him, and felt the weight of the case deepen. Tomorrow the hunt would move into the streets, into the shadows where gloves concealed more than hands. But tonight he allowed the silence of the office to envelop him, steady as the tide. Paris had a way of keeping its secrets in the crevices, in those narrow lanes where the gas lamps sputtered, where damp brick walls absorbed whispers, and where the Seine's fog curled like a living thing between shuttered windows. If the drowned man's debts had led Maigret to ledgers and clerks, the next truths would have to be pried loose from the city itself, in places where men spoke more freely to shadows than to officials. And for this he relied on Lucas and Janvier, his trusted lieutenants who knew how to walk unnoticed among the night's driftwood. Lucas was the older of the two, his body thickened by years of steady drinking, his face perpetually damp, as though a thin sweat clung to him regardless of weather. Yet he moved with surprising lightness, a man whose bulk concealed an agility of instinct. Janvier, younger and leaner, carried himself with the restless energy of one not yet dulled by habit, his sharp eyes quick to note small movements, his notebook always at the ready. Between them they balanced one another, Lucas with patience and a taste for long conversations over carafes of wine, Janvier with sharp questions dropped like pebbles into a pond, sending ripples outward. That night Maigret sent them into the quartier where the drowned man might once have walked before he met the river, the alleys behind Rue de la Roquette, the arcades of Bastille, the smoky bistros where dock workers and small clerks mingled in uneasy fraternity. Quietly, he had told them, always quietly. Paris revealed nothing to those who shouted. The two men began in a café near the Canal Saint-Martin, where bargemen gathered after unloading their cargo. The air inside was heavy with tobacco and damp wool, and the wooden tables bore the rings of countless glasses. Lucas ordered wine, Janvier a beer, and they sat as though to pass the evening in idle chatter. They listened more than they spoke. At the next table, two men argued over a card game, their voices rising then lowering abruptly, as one cast a nervous glance toward Lucas's bulky frame. Whispers followed, names half-spoken, fragments of stories about a creditor who had grown too bold, about a debtor who had disappeared. It was always the same. Hints, rumours, the tall figure glimpsed leaving in a carriage, gloves that never came off, even when the glass of wine warmed in his hand. Lucas leaned back, feigning disinterest, while Janvier scribbled a note under the table. They had learned long ago that truth in Paris seldom came whole. It arrived in pieces, scattered like cigarette butts on the floor, needing to be gathered and sorted. From there they moved to a small tavern near Rue Oberkampf, its sign swinging loose on rusted chains. Here the clientele was rougher, apprentices with soot on their cheeks, women with tired eyes, old men hunched over absinthe. Janvier struck up a conversation with a man whose hands were scarred from rope, a dock worker who had once worked in Le Havre. The fellow spoke reluctantly at first, but loosened with drink. "I saw him," he muttered. "Your drowned man. He came with the tall one. Sat at the corner table. Didn't speak much, just nodded. Looked like he owed more than he could pay." "Poor devil." Janvier pressed gently, his voice low, coaxing the man further. The dockworker shook his head, eyes darting toward the door. "Don't ask too much, the tall one. He has friends. Better not to speak of him." He drained his glass and left abruptly, leaving the words to settle like smoke. Lucas and Janvier exchanged glances. The trail was tightening. The tall man moved like a shadow through Paris, always a step ahead, leaving only the fear of his presence. Yet the drowned man had been with him, repeatedly, bound by debts that were more than money. They were shackles, invisible but unbreakable. Near midnight they made their way down Rue de Lappe, where music spilled from dance halls, accordions wheezing, couples spinning on sawdust floors. The atmosphere was brighter here, but beneath the gaiety lingered the same undercurrent of unease. Janvier spoke with a woman leaning against the wall outside, her shawl drawn close against the chill. She had known the drowned man, or thought she had. "He was gentle," she said, her voice tinged with melancholy. "Not like the others, always polite, but worried. His eyes were tired, as though he carried something too heavy." "And the tall man?" Janvier asked carefully. She looked away, pulled her shawl tighter. "Dangerous, that's all. Dangerous in a way you can't put into words. When he entered a room, everyone felt it. Even the music seemed quieter." Lucas thanked her with a small nod, pressing a coin into her hand. She slipped away into the crowd, leaving them with the image of a man whose presence silenced even music. By the time they returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, the sky was paling with the first hints of dawn. Their coats were damp with mist, their eyes red with fatigue, but their notebooks were heavier with fragments. They laid them before Maigret in his office, where the lamp still burned and smoke hung thick. He listened without interruption as they recounted each word, each hesitation, each fearful glance. The inspector sat with his elbows on the desk, pipe smoke curling around his broad face. He absorbed their findings in silence, his eyes half closed, as though the words were not merely heard, but tasted, weighed, sifted for the grain of truth within them. Lucas poured himself a small glass from the bottle on the shelf, while Janvier stretched his legs, yawning. They knew this rhythm well. They brought fragments. Maigret listened, and in his silence something unseen began to coalesce. When they had finished, Maigret rose heavily and walked to the window. The Seine lay beyond, grey and sluggish in the half-light, barges drifting like dark shadows. He stared at the water for a long while, his pipe glowing faintly, before speaking. "He was hunted," he murmured at last. "Not by chance, not by fate. Hunted. And when the river took him, it was because there was nowhere else left to go." Lucas and Janvier exchanged glances but said nothing. They understood that their chief spoke less to them than to himself, forming aloud the thoughts that guided him. The tall man was no longer a figure of rumour. He was real, palpable, his shadow heavy on the city. Somewhere in the alleys, in the dance halls, in the smoky cafes, he still moved, gloved hands concealing the grip that had driven one debtor into the Seine. The younger Janvier could not suppress a question. "Chief, do you think he'll make another move?" Maigret turned from the window, eyes narrowed, his face carved by fatigue and certainty. "Men like him always do. They cannot stop. And when he does, we'll be there." The office fell into silence again, broken only by the distant cry of gulls carried upriver from the markets. Maigret sank once more into his chair, pipe in hand, eyes fixed on the growing light beyond the window. The city was waking, unaware of the shadow that moved through its veins. But Maigret was aware. He had Lucas and Janvier, he had fragments of truth, and he had the patience of a river itself. The drowned man had spoken through debts, through fear, through silence. The tall man would speak next, though not willingly. And Maigret, immovable as stone, would be waiting when he did. By the time the story reached the papers, it no longer resembled the quiet discovery of a body along the embankment. Newsprint had a way of transforming shadows into spectacles, of feeding rumour with the weight of ink. The morning edition sprawled across kiosks, headlines screaming of a mysterious corpse pulled from the Seine, whispers of debts, suggestions of criminal networks stretching from Paris to Le Havre. None of it was precise. Much of it was invented, yet all of it had power. Maigret bought a copy from a boy near the Place Dauphine, the lad's fingers blackened with ink, his voice hoarse from shouting headlines. He tucked the folded sheet under his arm and walked slowly back toward the Quai des Orfèvres, the cold air damp against his cheeks. In the inspector's hand, the paper felt both trivial and weighty. He disliked how quickly the press could distort, yet he also knew that within the noise there was often a kernel of truth, or at least a reflection of what others feared to say aloud. In his office he unfolded the sheet, the paper crackling beneath his thick fingers. There it was, the drowned man reduced to a caricature, an anonymous bourgeois with links to shadowy dealings. The journalist had written with a flair for the dramatic, painting the figure of a tall, elegant man in gloves as though he were already a villain out of legend. Maigret frowned, pipe clenched between his teeth. He had spent his life sifting reality from fantasy, and he recognized when ink had been guided by gossip rather than fact. Still, the article unsettled him. Not because it told the truth, but because it revealed how quickly rumours spread, how easily the city hungered for scandal. Later that morning, Lucas entered carrying a stack of other newspapers. Each told the story differently. One suggested political intrigue, another hinted at smuggling along the channel, a third invented a liaison with a woman of society. The drowned man had become a vessel for every anxiety Paris wished to confess. Janvier arrived not long after, flushed from the cold, muttering that half the cafes were buzzing with the tale. Everywhere he went, people leaned close over their glasses, whispering about gloves, about debts, about bodies in the river. Maigret listened, silent, smoke wreathing his head like a halo of doubt. The press, he thought, was like the Seine itself. It carried everything downstream, truth, lies, speculation, detritus, indistinguishable at first glance. He knew better than to chase every rumour, but he also knew he could not ignore the tide. For somewhere hidden in the exaggerations was a fragment too real to have been invented. In the afternoon, he walked to a café near the Boulevard Saint-Germain, one of those brighter establishments where journalists gathered, their pockets bulging with notes, their eyes quick, their hands stained with ink. He sat at a corner table, ordered a carafe of wine, and listened. They did not notice him at first, or if they did, they pretended not to, assuming that the bulky figure in the overcoat was merely another patron. Their voices carried easily, overlapping, each eager to tell the other what he had heard, what he had invented. Debts with powerful men, I tell you, the kind who dine at Maxim's. Nonsense, it's a smuggling ring. Tobacco, maybe. That's why Le Havre is involved. I heard he had a mistress near Montmartre. Some say she vanished the very night he did. Each assertion contradicted the last, yet each was spoken with conviction. Maigret sipped his wine slowly, watching them through the haze of smoke, weighing their eagerness against the silence of the city he knew. They wanted drama, they wanted scandal, but they also sometimes stumbled against truths without recognizing them. At one point, a young journalist leaned forward, lowering his voice. "There's talk," he whispered, "that the man in gloves is no creditor but a magistrate himself. That's why no one dares name him." Laughter followed, disbelief mixed with unease. Maigret noted it silently, though he did not believe it. Yet the suggestion was telling. The shadow of the tall man had already grown beyond flesh and blood. He was becoming a figure of collective fear, a symbol whispered in cafes and printed in bold type. When he returned home that evening, Madame Maigret was waiting with her usual calm. She had seen the headlines too, of course. As she set supper before him, she remarked, almost casually, "They've made your drowned man into a story for the whole city." Maigret grunted, tearing bread with thick fingers. "They always do." She studied him for a moment, then said, "It must make your work harder when everyone thinks they already know the truth." He looked at her across the table, pipe smoke curling between them, and felt again that quiet intuition she carried. Yes, that was the difficulty. When truth became rumour and rumour became print, the lines blurred until even witnesses could not remember what they had seen and what they had read. The city itself began to conspire against clarity. After supper, as he sat in his armchair, he spread the papers once more, scanning each article with the patience of a man searching a riverbank for a glint among stones. One paragraph caught his eye, a brief mention of a clerk, unnamed, who had been visited by the deceased not long before his disappearance. The detail was small, buried among wild claims, but Maigret felt its weight. The journalists had heard something, perhaps from the very office he had visited. It was not invented, it was an echo of fact. He tapped his pipe against the ashtray, his mind steady, methodical. The press had dressed the truth in costume, but beneath the layers of exaggeration the drowned man's outline remained visible. A debtor, a man pursued, a shadow in gloves who appeared in every telling. The river had given him up, but the city would not let him rest until every café had wrung its story from him. In the days that followed, the rumours only thickened. Janvier reported that in one café the story had become political. In another, it was said the drowned man had betrayed his comrades. In yet another, he was a spy. Lucas shrugged, weary of sorting fact from invention, but Maigret listened to each with the same implacable patience. For he knew that lies were never harmless. They clung to the truth like barnacles, and sometimes they revealed more than they concealed. One evening, as he walked along the embankment, pipe glowing faintly in the dark, he overheard two students arguing near the Pont Neuf. "He was murdered by the police themselves," one insisted. "That's why they won't name him." The other laughed, calling it nonsense. Maigret passed them without a glance, but their words sank into him nonetheless. The city was turning the drowned man into a mirror, each face seeing its own fears reflected. Back in his office, he gathered the newspapers into a single stack, tied them with string, and set them aside. He did not need their noise any longer. He had enough. The rumours had shown him the shape of the void, a creditor who was more than a creditor, a man whose silence spread wider than any statement. The drowned man had been swallowed not only by the Seine, but by the city's hunger for stories. And somewhere, in that hunger, the truth still hid. Maigret leaned back in his chair, smoke rising, slowly toward the ceiling. He was not disturbed by the chaos of rumour. He had seen it before, and he knew it would continue. What mattered was to hold steady, to sift patiently, to wait for the single thread that would not break under pressure. The press might fill Paris with shadows, but he would find the man whose gloves left no fingerprints, whose presence silenced even music. The Seine flowed outside, indifferent as ever, carrying the city's reflections in its dark current. Maigret drew on his pipe, eyes heavy with thought, and let the rumors fade into silence. The case was no longer just a body on the embankment. It was becoming something larger, something that touched not only individuals, but the city itself, with all its anxieties and appetites. And the inspector, steady as the river, would wait until the noise subsided enough for the truth to be heard. The Palais de Justice rose against the grey Paris sky with the weight of centuries, its stones darkened by rain, its corridors echoing with the measured tread of men who carried both law and secrecy in their pockets. Maigret had walked these halls countless times, yet each approach reminded him that justice in Paris was not only written in codes and articles, but whispered in corners, bartered in gestures, half hidden behind files that vanished as easily as smoke. He entered slowly, his hat in hand, the heavy doors closing behind him with a groan. The air inside was cooler, tinged with the faint odour of wax polish and damp wool, the kind of scent that clung to rooms where records accumulated and never departed. Clerks hurried past with stacks of papers, lawyers in black robes spoke in hushed tones, and the distant murmur of a trial carried faintly through stone walls. Maigret moved among them with his deliberate stride, pipe resting unlit in his pocket, eyes scanning without appearing to. He was not here for documents, not today. He was here for a whisper. The drowned man's debts had led him from a Le Havre boarding house to a Paris clerk's ink-stained ledger. The rumours of the press had inflated the tale, but among the exaggerations he had caught the glimmer of a connection, someone too powerful to be named outright, someone whose silence weighed heavier than testimony. And now the Palais de Justice itself seemed to draw him forward, as though the building knew the name he sought was inscribed not on parchment, but in the nervous glances of men who avoided his gaze. He paused at the base of a grand staircase, its steps worn hollow by centuries of feet. A magistrate was descending, robe flowing behind him, his face pale beneath the powdered wig. When he saw Maigret, he faltered, the pause almost imperceptible. But the inspector noticed. The man recovered at once, continued down, and inclined his head stiffly. "Inspector." "Your Honour." Maigret's voice was low, steady. He fell into step beside the magistrate as they moved through the corridor. The magistrate's hands were gloved, though the air inside was not cold enough to require it. That detail did not escape Maigret. They walked in silence for several paces, the inspector's bulk dwarfing the man's narrow frame. Finally, the magistrate spoke, his voice scarcely above a murmur. "You should tread carefully, Maigret. Some debts are not meant to be collected." It was said without threat, yet it carried the weight of warning, the kind of sentence that lived on the edge between advice and intimidation. Maigret's jaw tightened around his pipe. He glanced at the magistrate's face, noted the thin line of his mouth, the eyes that did not meet his. "Who protects him?" Maigret asked simply. The magistrate shook his head, almost imperceptibly. "It's not a matter of protection. It is arrangement, compromise. The city runs on such things." His steps quickened, as though eager to escape the inspector's presence. "You have your corpse, Inspector. Leave the rest to the river." And with that, he turned sharply into another corridor, leaving Maigret standing in the cool draught of the great hall. The inspector remained motionless for a moment, pipe clenched in his teeth, the words settling into him like stones sinking into deep water. Arrangements, compromise, the language of institutions where silence was currency and whispers carried more than decrees. He resumed his walk, passing through the grand hall where shafts of light fell from high windows, illuminating dust motes suspended like tiny spectres. He saw clerks stiffen as he passed, conversations hush, eyes follow, and then turn quickly away. He had grown accustomed to such reactions. In these corridors his presence was less a comfort than a disturbance, like a gust of cold air that forced men to clutch their robes tighter. Later, in a smaller office off the main hall, he found a judge he had known for years, a man with a round face and weary eyes. They had shared many late hours over glasses of brandy, discussing not cases, but the weary burden of seeing too much. Maigret closed the door behind him, removed his hat, and sat heavily across from him. "You've heard the rumors," Maigret said. The judge exhaled slowly, his hand lingering over a stack of files. "Paris feeds on them." "This is no rumor. A man is dead. Drowned. He carried debts. And behind those debts stands a tall figure, gloved, always present, never named. You know him." The judge's eyes flickered, then dropped to the papers. His silence was confirmation enough. Maigret waited, as he always did, filling the pause with the faint creak of his chair and the unlit pipe between his teeth. At last the judge whispered, "If you pursue him, you will find yourself against more than one man. You will find the weight of houses, of families, of commerce. He lends not only money, but influence. He ensures silence when silence is useful, and in return the city looks away." "Until a body floats to the surface," Maigret said flatly. The judge winced. "Yes, but the city forgets quickly." He pushed the file toward the inspector without looking up. "This is all I can give you, and even this is too much." Maigret opened the folder. It contained nothing overt, no names shouted in ink, but there were patterns, transactions routed through companies with meaningless titles, debts signed under false names, the repetition of a signature in the margins, neat and elegant. He traced the lines with a thick finger, absorbing not the details but the shape of the web. "Thank you," he said finally, rising. The judge did not answer, only rubbed his temples as though weary from the act of betraying silence. Outside, the evening was settling. The lamps were being lit along the Seine, their glow casting trembling reflections on the water. Maigret stood on the steps of the Palais, coat collar turned up, and lit his pipe at last. The tobacco flared, the smoke curling against the night. He looked back once at the heavy doors, behind which men whispered warnings and hid truths in files. Then he turned toward the river, his steps steady, the sound of the city around him muffled by thought. The drowned man had carried debts, yes, but he had also carried the weight of a system designed to press men into silence. His death was not merely the story of one debtor and one creditor. It was a thread in a tapestry that stretched from Le Havre's docks to Paris's gilded halls, from cafes clouded with smoke to the Palais de Justice, where whispers carried more than verdict. Maigret drew deeply on his pipe, the ember glowing red in the dark. He felt the case shift within him, widening, pressing against the boundaries of ordinary crime. The tall man was no longer a figure haunting bistros and boarding houses. He was woven into the fabric of Paris itself, shielded by arrangements, guarded by silence. And yet Maigret, as steady as the tide, would follow the current wherever it led. The Seine flowed black and silent beneath the bridges, carrying the city's reflection in its current. Somewhere in its depths, the drowned man's story still lingered, but above, in the palaces of justice, the true weight of the case revealed itself, not in verdicts, but in whispers. Maigret walked into the night, pipe smoke curling behind him, already preparing for the next step, to find the place where the tall man shed his gloves and left behind traces of his life unguarded. Montmartre carried a different kind of fog than the embankments of the Seine. Here the mist was mingled with the smoke of cafes and dance halls, the laughter of girls drifting out into narrow streets, the cries of accordion players rising and falling like the hills themselves. Beneath the gaiety lurked the same shadows, the same secrets, only dressed in brighter colours. For days Maigret and his men had traced the tall figure's presence through fragments of rumour, half-formed confessions, whispers that died the moment they were spoken. Now the thread led upward toward the slopes of Montmartre, where the city blurred into spectacle and concealment. It was Lucas who first brought word of the apartment. He had been drinking with a concierge in a smoky café near Boulevard de Clichy, a woman whose sharp tongue spared no tenant. Between sips of cheap wine, she had spoken of a man who visited irregularly, never with the same name, but always with the same gloves. He kept a small apartment in a side street off Rue Lepic, a place no one entered but him and the occasional shadow of a woman whose face was never clear. Lucas relayed the story to Maigret, who listened in silence, pipe smoke curling in the lamplight. The inspector gave no order at once. He preferred the certainty of quiet verification. But his eyes told the rest. They would watch. For 2 nights, Lucas and Janvier took turns standing in the cold, collars turned up, shoulders hunched against the drizzle. The street was narrow, cobbled, lined with shuttered shops and staircases that wound upward into darkness. The apartment in question sat above a shuttered tailor's shop, its curtains always drawn, a single lamp sometimes glowing faintly at odd hours. The concierge passed with her broom, eyeing the 2 policemen with suspicion, but saying nothing. They waited, patient as cats at a mouse hole. On the 3rd night, just as the bells of Sacré-Cœur tolled faintly over the hill, the tall man appeared. He came in a dark overcoat, hat brim low, gloves glinting faintly in the gaslight. His movements were precise, unhurried, as though the street itself belonged to him. He glanced neither left nor right, unlocked the door with a key that shone briefly and disappeared inside. The lamp in the upstairs window glowed soon after, faint but steady, and the shadows of movement crossed the curtain. Lucas scribbled a note in his small, cramped hand. Janvier, younger, leaned forward eagerly, but Lucas's broad hand pressed his shoulder. "Not yet," he muttered. The following evening, Maigret himself came to stand in the shadows. His pipe glowed faintly, the ember hidden behind his cupped palm. He watched the building with the patience of stone, letting the rhythm of the street settle around him. A drunk sang off-key as he stumbled past. A woman laughed too loudly, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. A carriage clattered by, its wheels scattering water across the cobbles. Through it all, the inspector remained immovable, eyes fixed on the curtained window above the tailor's shop. He could almost feel the presence of the man inside, the weight of silence pressing outward. When at last the tall figure departed, Maigret followed at a distance. He did not hurry, did not seek to close the gap. He merely walked, pipe between his teeth, as though out for a night stroll. The man turned corners with the assurance of one who knew he was not pursued, his gloves gleaming faintly when they caught the light. At Rue des Abbesses. He entered a waiting cab, and Maigret stopped, watching, as the horse trotted off into the night. He made no attempt to follow further. The apartment itself would speak louder than any chase. The next morning, while the neighborhood still dozed, Maigret and his men entered the building with the quiet authority that required no announcement. The concierge handed over the spare key with a shrug, her eyes sharp with curiosity, but too cautious to question. Maigret climbed the stairs heavily, his steps muffled on the worn boards, and pushed open the door. The air inside carried the faint odour of cologne, tobacco, and dust. Curtains were drawn, leaving the room dim, the only light the pale beam of morning that slipped between their edges. The furnishings were sparse, almost impersonal, a narrow bed with sheets neatly made, a small table, a wardrobe, and a battered suitcase pushed beneath it. On the table lay a glass half filled with water gone flat, and beside it a pair of gloves, neatly folded. Maigret's eyes lingered on them, fine leather, well cared for, the kind one did not buy in ordinary shops. They seemed almost symbolic, resting there like a confession. Janvier moved quickly, searching drawers, turning over papers. Lucas examined the wardrobe, pulling coats aside, sniffing the fabric for traces of perfume. Maigret ignored them, instead lowering his heavy frame into the single chair by the table. He looked around slowly, taking in the silence, the neatness, the absence of clutter. It was not a home, it was a retreat, a hiding place, a room designed not for living, but for waiting. At last, Janvier exclaimed softly. He had found a scarf, delicate, with a faint trace of perfume still clinging to it. Maigret took it, held it to his nose, and closed his eyes briefly. A woman had been here, yes, but not recently. The scent was fading like an echo. He folded it carefully and set it on the table. Beside it, Lucas laid a small envelope discovered in the drawer. It contained only a single card, the name of the company to which the drowned man's debts had been bound. Nothing more. No address, no note. Yet the presence of that card here, in this secret apartment, tied the two men together beyond denial. Maigret struck a match, lit his pipe, and sat in silence while his men waited. He puffed slowly, smoke filling the dim room, mingling with the faint smell of cologne. Each detail was simple, almost banal, yet together they painted the outline of the man who had haunted their steps. Careful, precise, detached. A man who lived nowhere fully, who kept apartments like masks, shedding one for another as easily as gloves. Before leaving, Maigret opened the suitcase beneath the bed. Inside were a few shirts neatly folded, a razor, and a small notebook with pages torn out. Only fragments remained, half-sentences, lists of sums, initials without names. He turned them slowly, thick fingers careful not to tear the fragile paper. Nothing complete. Nothing incriminating, but enough to confirm what he already knew. This was a man who had built his life around absence, who left behind only fragments that pointed always to a deeper silence. They left the apartment as they had found it, the curtains still drawn, the lamp extinguished. On the street, the morning bustle had begun, market women calling out their wares, children darting between carts. To them the building was no more remarkable than any other, but for Maigret it had spoken volumes. As they walked back toward Boulevard de Clichy, Janvier could not contain himself. "Chief, why not arrest him now? We have enough." Maigret cut him off with a look, calm but firm. "Enough for suspicion, not for truth. Arrests are not nets thrown blindly into water. They must be certain, or the fish slip away forever." Janvier flushed, chastened, while Lucas grunted in agreement. They continued in silence, the hill of Montmartre rising behind them, the secret apartment fading into the mist of morning. That night, back in his office, Maigret sat alone, the card from the envelope lying on his desk beside the scarf. He stared at them for a long time, smoke curling upward into the dim light. They were only objects, ordinary in themselves, yet they carried the weight of a life lived in concealment. The drowned man's death was no longer a solitary tragedy. It was tied to a network of silence, to a man whose gloves touched every corner of Paris and beyond. The Seine moved outside, dark and implacable, carrying the city's secrets toward the sea. Maigret leaned back in his chair, eyes heavy but unyielding. The apartment near Montmartre had revealed enough to confirm what he already felt. The end was near. The tall man's silence would not last forever. And when it broke, the city itself would tremble. The fog had returned by the time Maigret stood again by the Seine, its thick tendrils weaving through the city like the breath of a slumbering beast. The bridges were ghostly outlines against the pale morning sky, and the river moved slowly beneath them, swollen with the weight of winter. Paris was waking, but the city was still veiled as though hiding its thoughts. Even in the daylight, the Seine always held secrets. It had swallowed too many men over the years, carried their bodies downstream with its silent, unyielding flow, and let the world continue as though nothing had been lost. But for Maigret, something had been lost, and it could not be let to float away into obscurity, as it so often did. The case, so simple at its start, had grown into something more. A man drowned, debts that led to shadows, rumours that filled cafes, and at the centre of it all, a figure in gloves whose name no one seemed to know, yet whose presence cast a long, dark shadow over everything. The tall man, always just out of reach, whose silence had buried the drowned man beneath layers of fear and whispers. Maigret drew slowly on his pipe, the embers lighting his face in the soft gloom, and watched the water shift and twist in its eternal course. His thoughts were tangled, but he felt the tug of conclusion pulling at him, the slow recognition that the threads had finally come together. He had followed them through foggy streets, through hidden apartments, through the maze of debts and lies that had spread across the city, and now, at last, he had reached the end. The river had carried away the last of the answers, but not in the way he had expected. The previous days had been spent in a blur of cold offices, late-night stakeouts, and tense conversations with men who could not be trusted to speak freely. And yet, in the end, it had not been a confrontation that solved the case, but rather the quiet unfolding of truths that had been ignored for too long. Maigret had spent the better part of his life walking alongside the currents of Paris's underworld, watching as things were hidden in plain sight, as people lied to themselves and to others, and as the city moved ever forward, as indifferent to the human cost as the flow of the Seine itself. But this time, the city had yielded. The tall man, the creditor in gloves, had been right under his nose all along. Not a shadowy figure in some distant office, nor a ghostly presence walking between cafes and apartments, but a man known by name to the very institutions of power that had supposedly protected the drowned man, a magistrate, a figure whose influence ran deep, whose touch reached even the hidden corners of Paris's most powerful circles. The river had not been the final resting place of the drowned man. It had only been the beginning of the truth. And as it was with so many things, that truth had slipped through the cracks of the city, invisible to those who sought it, but clear as day to those who knew where to look. As Maigret stood on the banks of the Seine, he heard the faint creak of a rowboat approaching, its paddles dipping into the water with the rhythmic, familiar sound of work. He glanced over his shoulder, noting the figure in the boat. A small man, hunched against the cold, his face obscured by the low brim of his cap. The boat moved silently toward the quay, its shadow barely distinguishable from the waters. Maigret felt the slightest stir of recognition, but did not turn. The river carried its dead, but it also carried men like this, those who worked with the flow, those who steered the city's secrets. When the boat reached the shore, the man in the cap stood, his hands steady, as he tied the rope to the dock. Maigret waited, knowing the man would not approach him immediately, not until he had finished his task. The rower moved with the casual efficiency of one accustomed to working beneath the city's surface, not seen but always there, keeping things moving. At last, the man looked up, meeting Maigret's eyes for the first time. The inspector had known who he was before he even spoke, had recognized him in the glint of his gaze, in the way he carried himself. "Inspector Maigret," the man said, his voice hoarse from the cold, but steady. "The city changes, but it never forgets." Maigret nodded, offering no greeting in return. The man climbed out of the boat, leaving it tied to the dock, and made his way up to the embankment where Maigret stood, his boots leaving impressions in the wet ground. He was a man whose appearance betrayed little, a small-time worker, one of many who ran the city's unnoticed veins. But Maigret knew better than to underestimate the quiet ones. This man had seen it all, had carried secrets long before the drowned man had ever crossed his path. "You have questions," the man continued, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had learned to hold his tongue, even when it ached to speak. "And you've followed them well, but you're not the first to come looking, Inspector. Others have come and gone, just as you will. The tall man, the creditor, has lived in this city for a long time. He's been part of its foundations, part of its very machinery. He doesn't break, not for anyone." Maigret felt a slow tightening in his chest, a familiar sensation that came when the answers were almost within reach, but not quite. He had heard rumors, had gathered fragments of the man's life, but the final piece, the truth of the tall man's role, still remained elusive. He took a slow drag on his pipe, watching the smoke curl up into the air, his eyes distant, focused not on the present, but on the quiet whirlpool of thoughts within him. "Why does he kill, then?" Maigret asked softly, his voice low but unyielding. "What does it take to drive a man like that to murder?" The rower paused, his eyes narrowing. For a moment he seemed to weigh the inspector's words, then sighed, pulling the collar of his coat tighter. "It's not murder," he said quietly. "It's just business. People like him don't see death as an end. They see it as an inevitability, something that comes to those who can't pay their debts. The drowned man was just another failure, another name on a list. There's nothing personal in it. He was a casualty of a system that doesn't care. It's the way things are." Maigret stood silent for a moment, feeling the weight of those words settle on him. The man had spoken the truth in a way, but it had the hollow ring of justification, the kind that came from those who were too deeply embedded in a system to see the human cost of it. To the tall man, the drowned man had been no more than a failure, a casualty of the endless cycles of money and power that churned beneath Paris's surface. And in the end, it was the city that had swallowed him whole, as it had swallowed so many others. The rower turned to leave, but Maigret's voice stopped him. "Who is he really?" the inspector asked. "The tall man, what's his name?" The rower glanced back, his expression unreadable, then shook his head slowly. "Some things are meant to stay buried, Inspector. Some things are never meant to see the light." Maigret felt a bitter taste in his mouth, the realization settling over him like a cold weight. The tall man would remain a shadow, his name never spoken, his actions cloaked in the same silence that had allowed him to thrive. The Seine would carry him away, as it always had, and the city would forget, as it always did. As the rower pushed off into the mist once more, Maigret stood by the river, watching the boat disappear into the grey. The case had ended, not with the resolution he had hoped for, but with the quiet finality of the Seine itself, the river that never spoke, the river that carried its secrets to places no one could follow. And in that moment, as the fog thickened around him and the distant hum of the city grew softer, Maigret understood. Some mysteries, like the river, would always remain just beyond the reach of those who sought to unravel them.